beyond the realities of trying to wage what is now a 42-month full-scale invasion, what has Putin gotten out of it? He got a photo op with Trump last Friday. Yay. 3 days later, what's he got? Now, you come back to me in 3 days because I love talking to you. And if he's been able to figure out how to pull the yo-yo strings, maybe we're in a different position. But I think his options are limited right now.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're speaking to Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also founder and editor of EA Worldview, and very much a friend of the show. Scott, welcome back.
Hey, thank you for letting me join the party.
Well, we're speaking just after President Trump and President Zelensky met and spoke to press at the Oval Office. And in fact, as we're talking now, there is another wider meeting going on with Trump and all of those European leaders. What do you make of what we're seeing?
Huge win for Zelensky in Europe. Cannot, I think, underestimate this. Now, we'll need a few days to see how this plays out, but let me lay this out for you. Going into this today, we've got Friday where Trump's basically like a yo-yo. So who's pulling the string, right? And Putin's pulling the string last Friday because the Europeans and Zelensky have been bolstering Trump. Ceasefire sanctions. Putin has that meeting in Alaska to push back the sanctions threat, succeeds. To get the narrative off of ceasefire, succeeds. And he gets the bonus that the Americans put up this Putin proposal, which is not only do I get part of the east and south of Ukraine, you got to give me all of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in eastern Ukraine. You got to give me territory I don't even have at this point. And so, some of us looking at the weekend going, geez, Trump has folded. We watched him fold to Putin, but is he really folded to that extent? Credit to Zelensky and the Europeans. And this, story I can tell you actually goes back, going back to February. And I'll explain why if you wish. They kept their eye on the ball. They kept their eye on the strings, which is how do we pull the strings when we see Trump on Monday? Now, part of that is going to be in the sense of presentation. And that is, and as other people have noted, it's not just Zelensky who's there. It's 7 European leaders. European Commission President von der Leyen, NATO head Rutte, 5 national leaders. They do that to show unity, but also it prevents Zelensky from being isolated like he was at the notorious February 28th meeting with the J.D. Vance ambush. Now, that has worked a treat. In fact, it's actually worked better than I expected. The original schedule, Louis, was we have the presser, then we have Trump and Zelensky on a one-on-one meeting, and then he meets the Europeans. It looks like what has played out here is they've gone straight from the Zelensky-Trump presser to the Europeans and Zelensky in with Trump. So there's no chance for any bad actors. I'm looking at you, Steve Witkoff, possibly J.D. Vance, spoiling it in that meeting between. So when we have this presser, the win on presentation is, despite certain pro-Trump journalists trying to bait him, Zelensky doesn't take the bait. He dresses real nice. You have a whole, made up stuff about the suit, and he's wearing a suit this time. And Zelensky skillfully points it out. Look at me, my nice suit. I'm learning from you. Look at me. He flatters Trump at every opportunity. Key moment. He gives Trump a letter from Elena Zelenska, the first lady, to Melania Trump to establish that personal bond. And that follows on, by the way. That's really important because Melania Trump is starting to take more of an interest in what's happening. She's been working on Donald about how mean Vladimir Putin is. And she sent a letter to Putin in Alaska saying, you should let these Ukrainian children go that you've deported. So Zelensky's working that angle. And then even though Trump is going off the rails, quite often he's incoherent. It's a me thing. He's slagging off the media. He's slagging off the Biden administration. In one bizarre moment, he's slagging off mail-in voting. Zelensky never interjects. He never jumps in, and he never makes the mistake he made in February of saying diplomacy doesn't work with Putin. Never makes that mistake. So not only is it important who spoke, who didn't speak. the Trump envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and J.D. Vance just sits there. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was off to the side looking like he wanted to be the bully in the playground, scowling. But, I think Pete was just concentrating on tough guy pose and wasn't quite sure what was going on. Big win. And it took me from a few minutes to get to the reveal. For all the rambling and incoherence of Trump, several times he repeated that the United States will join Europe potentially in security guarantees for Ukraine. The Trump administration has never done that. They have stood against that. Remember, they cut off military aid earlier this year. Remember, J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference said, we're out of here. Bye, kids. Going home. It's up to you, Europe. Now, Trump is saying, we will protect you. Now, that may not mean American troops. And that's where the media will get, is it American troops? Is it American troops? It doesn't have to mean American troops. It can mean European troops, but it means American intelligence sharing, American logistics, American engineering, American transport, American cooperation, and American weapons, albeit by selling them to NATO, who then transfers to Ukraine. If this is the arrangement that is confirmed coming out of these meetings, it puts Vladimir Putin in a very difficult position. Actually, there's a second takeaway that puts him in a difficult position. In addition to the security guarantees, remember this, Vladimir Zelensky, I look forward to a trilateral meeting with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Trump, I think a trilateral meeting would be great. And we know it would because it's more publicity for Donald. But who doesn't want a trilateral meeting? Vladimir Putin does not recognize Vladimir Zelensky as the president of Ukraine. He doesn't recognize the Zelensky government. So now Putin has got to face a prospect of, does he reject an arrangement which includes security guarantees for Ukraine? And does he reject that trilateral meeting, which makes him look like the bad guy? Even though we're no longer talking about ceasefire, we're talking about, quote, peace deal. And if he rejects it, does Trump blame Zelensky? On the evidence of today, no. If Putin keeps killing Ukrainian civilians, which they've done today, at least 14 were killed at latest count, then he once again becomes the bad guy as he was a few weeks ago when Trump was threatening sanction. So far, and things can change, this is Trump world, but so far, this is Zelensky in Europe getting what they've come to Washington for. They have retaken the political, diplomatic, and even the military initiative.
And I want to dig into that. You talked about Putin and how the Russians are going to be reading this. We hear that Trump is in indirect communication with Putin just ahead of this meeting with Zelensky. I suppose it's not just Putin we should be thinking about here, but how are the Kremlin more widely going to be reacting to this meeting? Because they were presumably pretty confident on Friday. Maybe not so much now if US troops are being discussed.
Yeah. First of all, indirect communication. That means Trump and Putin did not talk directly ahead of this meeting, if I understood what he was saying. That raises the question of which officials talk to each other. We'll need to tease that out. During the presser, Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Russia, he's one of Putin's top financial guys, he goes off on X and goes, peace deal, not a ceasefire. Peace deal, not a ceasefire. Hey, man, that ship is done sailed. Because the fact of the matter here is that you now are talking about Ukraine and Europe getting the initiative by saying, are you going to agree to terms which are going to freeze the front lines, which in effect is going to be a ceasefire, as well as the additional terms, the additional military or economic terms. There is what I watch it for from the Kremlin is this, and that is, do they dare do this? Do they dare come out and say, we can only accept this deal if, one, there are no security guarantees for Ukraine, and two, if we get this additional territory in the Donetsk region, which we do not occupy at this point. So I think maybe, Louis, we need to spend a couple minutes just talking about where we are in the territorial arrangements and how this all plays out here. Coming out of Friday in Alaska, as I mentioned, the Russians are trying to spin Trump and the real estate developer, Steve Witkoff, into saying for there to be security, we have what we hold in southern Ukraine, parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia. We're such nice people, we're not going to demand all of that, even we annexed it. But we are going to demand all of the Luhansk and the Donetsk regions. Now, that is not going to happen. That's a deal breaker. And it's a deal breaker, just to be clear, as I know other specialists have been saying on Times Radio, because that northern part of the Donetsk region is fortified towns, fortified cities. It is integral at this point to the defense of Ukraine. If Russia was to take that territory or be given that territory, it then becomes integral to Russia's occupation. But it also, as the Finnish president Alexander Stubb told Trump last week, opens up the highway to Kyiv. That if Russia wanted to attack again, it's much easier than it was in 2022. So Zelensky and the Europeans have got to push that back. And I'm banking on the fact I think they will. I think the Russians then have got a hard call to make. And I'm going to add something, by the way, because look, for everyone on our comments page, Russia is winning, Russia's winning. And for every political commentator, Russia's winning. Deep State, one of the best war monitors that's out there, and I don't know if you saw this, Louis, today, since November of 2022, the amount of territory that Russia has gained with all of its military operations, with all of its hundreds of thousands of casualties, with all of its expenditure of equipment, the amount of territory that Russia has taken in Ukraine is less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. They went from about 19% in November 2022 to 20%. So Russia is not making rapid gains in the East right now. And if Russia's not making rapid gains in the East, they can't count on prosecuting this war for a quick military breakthrough. Do they continue to reject the political and diplomatic route? That's going to be the key question after today.
And I want to dig down a little more into that trilateral meeting that Trump is proposing. I mean, I say proposing, as he continues speaking now with European leaders, he's used the term when, not if, for this trilateral meeting with Zelensky and Putin, and saying that, earlier he was saying the fighting will go on without Putin's agreement to do that trilateral meeting. How much does how does this look for Putin if he's going to get strong-armed into this meeting he's refused to have since the war began?
This is such a hard call for the Kremlin. I mean, this is such a hard call for it, because when they went to Alaska last week, that was their last card to really play with Trump. They'd given Trump the phone calls. They'd given him the flattery on social media. They were holding out. They did not want to give him the face-to-face until they absolutely had to. Now, remember, the reason why they gave him the face-to-face was to push the sanctions threat back. And when they gave Trump the face-to-face, because you remember, Trump said, we're going to meet face-to-face, then we're going to have the trilateral meeting. The Russians said, no, we're not going to do that. Well, they're back in that position now. It's not going to suffice for the Russians to say to Trump, we will see you one-on-one again. Trump's not going to go for that. Trump's going to want this trilat, or at least I think he will. If I'm wrong, I'll put my hand up. I think Trump's going to want the trilateral now. And again, it was repeated a few days ago. They said, we must have the root cause of the conflict addressed. And that's Kremlin speak for, we have to be allowed to seize Ukrainian territory. We have to keep the rest of Ukraine weak and demilitarized. We have to have the sanctions lifted on us, and we have to get the Zelensky government out. Well, you can't get the Zelensky government out if you're sitting down with them at the table. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch this over the next 24, 48 hours. I think they're going to try to spin Trump, but I can't right now see their lever. I can't see their play with Trump right now.
And we're speaking about the kind of difference almost between that meeting on Friday and the meeting that is ongoing now. I just wonder if you could talk about the optics a little bit of these two meetings. Big flashy meeting on Friday,
Yeah.
but the substance less so. No conversations with the press. Very short address from Trump and even Putin. Whereas we now have these leaders sat down around the table, two big meetings, a lot of conversation with the press. How different are those optics, and what does that mean on the world stage?
It's massive, but it's massive away in that Vladimir Putin's made a series of gambles where I think he's gotten short-term advantage and then he's lost in the longer run. This goes all the way back to the initial full-scale invasion. on Friday, if you think about it, he gets everything he wants in the short term out of Trump. We've explained that. But he does so by making Trump look small in the process. If you compare the optics between Trump coming out, it's my friend Vlad, it's my great friend Vlad, we're going to have a peace deal, yay, Vlad, and applauding. And then you look at the body language when Trump's at the presser with Putin, and he's scowling, he's uncertain, he's twitchy, he looks defeated. And if you don't think he knows that because he spent several minutes of the presser with Zelensky today complaining about how the media were talking about. He looked defeated on Friday. Now, what has Zelensky done already in that presser today? He has not tried to upstage Trump. He has remained silent. He's been deferential. Trump gets to look like the big guy in the room. Look at the photo with the European leaders just before you and I came on air. Trump is in the center of the European leaders. Zelensky is to his right, Emmanuel Macron to the left, all looking very serious, but Trump gets to hold position. You're in the middle right now of the comments to the press before the meeting with the Europeans. Who gets to have the initial comments? Trump can go on for as long as he wants to. He gets to look like the big man on campus. Now, everybody knows that intellectually he's not. Everybody knows in terms of policy he's not. But everybody knows that to get what you want out of the Trump administration, he has to think he is. And I'll circle back to our previous question. How does Russia change those optics back? How do they make him look big after they made him look small last week?
And on top of that, with the optics here, I mean, we've just had President Macron of France speaking, and the words he used to discuss those security guarantees was that we're not talking about security just for Ukraine. We're talking about European security as a whole, guarantees for all of Europe. That's quite crucial, isn't it? That it's not seen from this this war that Russia have been able to separate Europe and America from in a security standpoint.
This is massive, Louis. This is absolutely massive. And I want to walk this back 6 months to think about where we were 6 months ago back in February. Trump administration's just come in. We still don't know if Trump's going to commit to NATO. We still keep thinking about Trump 1.0, where he was threatening to pull out of NATO. You got J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, giving it large about how you take care of yourselves. We don't need you. We're going to look at Asia. We're going to look at other parts of the world. Off you go, right? You got a defense secretary, Pop Gun Pete Hegseth, who probably doesn't know Slovenia from Slovakia, as well as knowing his backside from his elbow, as my grandfather would say. Well, he's going to be useless as breaking wind in a thunderstorm. Who is going to be there working with the Europeans on European security questions? What was important back then for Ukrainian European security is that European leaders, and here you got to give Keir Starmer credit, because he and Macron came up and said, look, we're going to talk about security guarantees for Ukraine, and we're going to talk about it as part of European security. And then you've got to give the EU credit, as well as Europeans in NATO, for saying we've got to step our defense investment in production. Take it forward to those comments you just had today, where you've got Macron saying, this is a part of an investment which is for our security as well as Ukraine. We've got the U.S. invested in our security again, whether that's through NATO, whether that's through bilateral arrangements, whether that's through support of Ukraine. That's a huge shift from where we are in February, and it's a huge loss for the Kremlin, because it was counting on the fact that they could get the Americans to take a hike and they could pick off the Europeans on their own.
And you were talking about Starmer just there, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. He's just been discussing with Trump the idea of the coalition of the willing, and he's not just talking about what they were earlier saying a NATO-style security guarantee. He's actually referred to it as Article 5 style. I mean, how big of a challenge is that to Russia if Ukraine gets a sort of Article 5 guarantee in all but name?
Ding, ding, ding. Those are the magic words. Ukraine will not get into NATO. Okay. Now, they will say they want to keep getting into NATO, but that's a red line for the Kremlin. And Trump on Truth Social was saying, we're not going to let Ukraine into NATO. Okay. Question here is does Ukraine get firm security guarantees that effectively make it an associate of NATO? Now, there's an important background to this, and our Ukrainian friends out there will remind us of this in comments. Ukraine had the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 that was supposed to provide security assurances. That's why it gave up nuclear weapons. Ukraine went through the process in the early 21st century of negotiations with the Russians. And then, of course, you had the Minsk agreements, and those security assurances got violated. So you've got to have security assurances that are more than assurances. You've got to have guarantees. And Article 5 is NATO's commitment to collective defense. If one NATO member is attacked, the other NATO members come in and they defend it. It means if Ukraine gets attacked again by the Russians, every NATO member comes to its aid, at least in principle. Up to this point, Trump administration had never countenanced that, never countenanced it. And in fact, I would go as far as to say, I don't think the Biden administration had countenanced going this far. So think about it here, that the administration that only a few months ago had cut off all assistance to Ukraine is the one that comes in on the Article 5 commitment. And I would be skeptical of that happening, except for the fact Keir Starmer just said it in front of cameras. You don't go big on that unless you think there's a good chance that that's going to happen. And once again, that puts the ball in Putin's court, which is what the Russians are saying right now is, we'll accept, at least Mikhail Ulyanov, one of their envoys, said yesterday, all right, security guarantees for Ukraine as long as we get security guarantees. But I suspect their idea of security guarantees for Russia is you can't have NATO involvement inside Ukraine. Well, that's what Article 5 does. That draws the line with the Russians. Are you going to accept it, Vlad? Or are you going to keep this war going? Your call.
And at the heart of what we've seen in these meetings over the last few days, there's a very different, I think, almost ideological approach from both sides here. Russia very much focusing on the ground, the physical territory, the Donbass area that they're so keen to secure now and gain that extra bit of territory they haven't managed to get on the ground. Whereas the West is very much focusing, it seems, on changing and transforming that security infrastructure that has governed, most of Europe and the West, since World War II. Has Putin dropped the ball here on what he would call NATO encroachment?
I think Putin has just dropped the ball. Well, I'm not sure he's dropped the ball. I think it was a fundamental in terms of what Vladimir Putin wants. Look, the reason why Zelensky and the Europeans can do this, and I know some of our Ukrainian friends don't like hearing this, but that is the Zelensky government and the Europeans have effectively said, look, in the short term, we have to accept the Russian occupation of the areas that they have right now. Now, there's certain things that will have to be discussed, like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Here, I'm thinking that probably goes to international supervision, but you can't push Russia out of Crimea and out of parts of those 4 regions. So that means that Zelensky and the Europeans are not going in and demanding that the Russians give up territory. Vladimir Putin is demanding that Ukraine give up territory. Now, why is he doing that? Vladimir Putin, when he went in and attacked Kyiv on February 24th, 2022, it was not just to take part of Ukraine. He wanted to take all of Ukraine, either in terms of taking its territory, as you mentioned, Louis, or in terms of putting a pro-Russian government into power. He wanted to make Ukraine part of Greater Russia. He still wants to make Ukraine part of Greater Russia. His legacy is making Ukraine part of Greater Russia. In September 2022, he announced the annexation of those 4 regions. He'd already announced the annexation of Crimea because this was going to be Greater Russia. If he gets anything less than that out of a deal, he doesn't fulfill his legacy. And that's why I think he keeps pushing, Louis. I think it's not as much ideology. It's a personal project that's here. And that is, beyond the territorial issue, the other thing where I think he keeps attacking Ukraine civilians. Why don't you back off for a week and get yourself some credit? Because that's what Trump wants you to do. Why don't you back off for a week? And the only way I can read it and explain it is that he and others think they can break Ukraine civilians by doing this day in, day out. And guess what? You can't. As tired as Ukrainians are of the war, as much as I think some of them are going to be willing to accept a deal where they have to give up part of their country in the short term, they're not going to give up their nation. And I don't think he's clocked it. I still don't think he's clocked it. So upshot of this is Zelensky and the Europeans have got room for maneuver here. Putin doesn't have room for maneuver on the fundamental points that he set down.
And is that victory somewhat hollow for Putin if he gets that land recognized by the US but not recognized by European partners and by the Ukrainians? If it's de jure by some and de facto by others?
Yeah, that's interesting, Louis. I just came to you off of Indian television, and the presenter was saying, look, Russia has not come out and openly called for the international recognition of Crimea and the other 4 regions as such. It's like, so it doesn't mean that much to him. I don't buy that. I mean, Vladimir Putin has not just occupied these regions, he has annexed them. He has staged a referendum in Crimea to pretend that it's his territory. They have staged votes in, the occupied areas of the East and the South to pretend it's theirs, and it's just a crock. And everybody knows it's a crock, but Putin wants to get this recognized. That's, if you look at the billboards in all these areas, it's like, this is ours, this is Russian territory. And I think, and this is where I think, and I can understand why they did it, I think they miscalculated. I think they thought at times they had Trump in their pocket. And after last Friday in Alaska, I think, have they put him back into their pocket? And now they haven't got him there. The analogy here is not that Trump is compromised always with the Russians. With respect to some other of your great Times Radio presenters, it's yo-yo now. He yo-yos back and forth between whoever's pulling strings. And again, the upshot of this is what Putin really wants is legitimacy. There's a projection here. When he says Vladimir Zelensky is not legitimate, he wants to be legitimate. Okay, where's your legitimacy, Vlad? You're wanted by the International Criminal Court because you deported Ukrainian children. Officially, up to 20,000. Unofficial estimates, up to 300,000. Where's your legitimacy there? You are effectively facing the fact that you may be wanted for war crimes beyond that deportation at a certain point. The only countries who are really dealing with you diplomatically are countries like Belarus, North Korea, Iran, and some African countries that will deal with you. You have isolated your country economically and diplomatically from much of the world, even if some of the world's sitting on the fence about it. Where's your legitimacy in making Russia great? And here I'm just going to interject another feature because it always drives our YouTube commenters crazy, those of the pro-Kremlin ilk. How's your economy doing, Vlad? In terms of your legitimacy and greatness, when you're now having to ration gasoline in Crimea and part of Eastern Russia, and it only is available for enterprises, when gasoline prices are significantly spiking elsewhere because your oil refineries are getting blown up, when your potatoes and beets are not being harvested because your agricultural equipment's not being repaired, where's your legitimacy? And by the way, I'm not saying the Russian economy is going to collapse. Every commenter who's pro-Kremlin is going to get that wrong. What I'm saying here is that beyond the realities of trying to wage what is now a 42-month full-scale invasion, what has Putin gotten out of it? He got a photo op with Trump last Friday. Yay. 3 days later, what's he got? Now, you come back to me in 3 days because I love talking to you. And if he's been able to figure out how to pull the yo-yo strings, maybe we're in a different position. But I think his options are limited right now.
And I want to just briefly cover some of the other optics from the US side of this. You mentioned before who was and who wasn't talking today. Very quiet JD Vance in that Oval Office meeting.
Yeah, and because I think JD has got his eyes elsewhere now. The way to read JD Vance is JD's first and foremost calculation is not geopolitics. It's not military matters. It's not economic matters. It's what's good for J.D. Vance? What was good for J.D. Vance back in February was playing the tough bully boy in terms of foreign policy by going over and sticking it to the Europeans, because a lot of the Make America Great Again wannabes said, yeah, that's it. We've showed those lame European liberal, whatever you want to call it, right? Oh, cheese eating surrender monkeys. There you go. We've shown them what they're like. And that was JD's shtick back in February. But it was interesting that, remember, JD comes on holiday to England, right? Now, where's JD's interest now? Okay, well, JD has a conversation with UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy. And Lammy talks to him about Ukraine and about European security. And then Lammy talks to the Europeans about it. JD didn't say anything to upset the idea that the United States is now restoring military assistance, albeit selling it to Ukraine via Europe. Doesn't play with that, right? He doesn't mess around with that gradual shift of U.S. policy back towards Ukraine. What JD was doing, by the way, and I'd love to talk to you about this on another occasion. Unfortunately, it's outside Frontline's remit, so you've got to rebrand his Trump report, is JD is meeting a lot of hard right British activists out there in the Cotswolds, including Nigel Farage, to talk about how they're going to take over the U.S. and the U.K. because the U.S. and the U.K. have been, we're going to restore free speech against all these liberal cancel culture people, which is a whole crock of hooey. But that's JD's project now, is to support right-wing parties in Europe. So he doesn't want to detach from Europe now. He doesn't want to walk away from Europe. He just wants to get his type of Europeans into power. So he's going to play it in a different way, both in terms of where he wants to be when he runs for president in 28 and the type of Europe that he wants. Paradoxically, though, if he's not going to walk away from Europe, even if it's for hard right parties, he can't walk away from European security because, Louis, here's a stinger for your audience. A lot of important people in that room today, a lot of important people. I mean, it's important Zelensky's there. It's obvious, right? Important that Mark Rutte's there because of the NATO element that's there. Von der Leyen, it's important because of the EU presence. It's important that Alexander Stubb, now there's a name you don't often hear. The Finnish president's there because Trump likes him because they play golf together. And it's important to bring this back around to JD that the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, is there. Why is that important? Well, because Trump fancies Georgia. He kind of likes her. He's one of the few women politicians he's ever said anything good about. And because Meloni is from a very right-wing party, from Brothers of Italy. In fact, when she was campaigning for office, she was as hard right as any American hard right activist was. Now, she's come in just a bit for pragmatic reasons. That's the type of politician Vance can work with Meloni. So if JD's going to be involved with Europe and try to push right-wing politicians, he's got to come back into the fold on European security.
And just finally, Scott, one thing I did want to pick up on was there was this slightly odd moment where a brief discussion came out about Ukrainian elections. Zelensky very quick to say we will have elections as soon as it's secure, we're able to do that. But Trump's response to that was to just sort of, you almost saw this light bulb above his head when this idea of martial law and pausing elections came up. I mean, is that just a very edgy Trump joke, or are we having a worrying look into Trump's mind there?
I was only joking, folks. I was only joking. Let's set this up first of all, because this is part of the wider thing of big win for Zelensky in Europe. There are a lot of, you know how these Trump press conferences are set up now, that they like Trump supporters in there. These guys, journalists in quote marks, right? I recognized a few of them. I won't call them out by name, but let's put it this way. These guys are Trump activists, right? And they wanted to bait Zelensky into what had happened at the end of February. So that was one of these pro-Trump journalists who's like, it's that line of, you don't have elections, therefore you're a dictator, which Trump said back 6 months ago. Now, Zelensky handled the question really, really well, which is during wartime, we can't have elections. When we have a truce and we get all this, then we can go back to our democratic processes. Absolutely spot on. But you're absolutely right that Trump said, I don't give him the benefit much that often, Louis, as folks know. I'm going to give him the benefit on this one. I think he was trying to have a bit of fun, which was that whole idea. So you're saying in 3.5 years, if we're at war, Trump 2028, right? And the thing is that although you picked up on it, I don't think many people in the room figured out what was going on. So it was a joke that kind of fell flat, right? But I suspect some of my colleagues who are very suspicious of anything that Trump says will come out tomorrow and say, that's it. Now, I got to get very serious here to say that I think Trump was trying to tell a joke at this part, but there was another segment which was not a joke, which is great. Trump went off on a lot of rambling deviations. Most of the press conference was about him. For example, that really strange idea that they're going to ban not just mail-in ballots, but they're going to ban electronic voting, right? At one point, he's all about how great it is that he has militarized Washington, D.C. by putting the National Guard in there. And made up, and again, flat out lied that Washington was crime-ridden. Now it has no crime. And just to repeat, Washington's crime rate is down 26% this year. Violent crime is down 26% this year. So Trump is not only sent the National Guard into Washington, D.C., and there are Republican states that are offering to send people into D.C. Trump's people are talking about sending the National Guard into other cities, all of whom have Democratic administrations, by the way. So the martial law, 3.5 years, maybe I'll run again, joke. The militarization of American cities, which Trump went on about, not a joke. And I'll keep my red lines on that one very narrowly between those two, because there's a fine line between humor and authoritarianism.
Well, Scott, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you as we get the latest on this meeting. And as you say, I'm sure there'll be plenty more interviews this week with yourself and our other programs, Trump Report, all of which, including Frontline, are available on YouTube or on your favorite podcasting outlet. But Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute and founder and editor of EA Worldview, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you, Louis. Until the next time, stay safe, stay sane.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.